Steps. The letter was from the conference board. They wanted her, not just to attend, to speak. Her mother didn't understand. "You wrote some math drawings, and now they want you to go to some hotel and give a talk?" she asked, confused, wiping her hands on an apron stained with red clay. June didn't know how to explain it either, but in her heart she knew something had shifted. It wasn't about the stage, or the professors, or the microphones. It was the first time in her life someone said, "We see you. We see how you think. Come show us more." On the night before she left, June sat on the barn roof, notebook in her lap, stars swimming above her in wide, slow arcs. She didn't know what would happen in Denver, but she whispered 3 words to herself anyway. "Don't back down." She looked at the spiral one last time and drew one more triangle, smaller than the rest, curved like a smile. The notebook had no name, no stickers, no title scrawled across the front, just a battered black cover with frayed corners and faint outlines of soil smudges where June's fingers had pressed for too many seasons. She carried it like other girls carry diaries or pocket mirrors, tucked close to the chest, under jackets, under shame, and sometimes under doubt. It wasn't just a collection of sketches. It was a record of how her mind worked when the world wasn't telling her who she was supposed to be. And now, somehow, it was the reason she had a ticket to Denver. June sat at the kitchen table with the letter beside her, chewing the cap of a cheap ballpoint pen. Her mother paced behind her, rubbing her wrists nervously. "I still don't get it," her mom muttered for the 3rd time. "They just... What? Want you to stand up and talk?" "About how I see irrational numbers," June replied quietly. Her mom huffed, picked up a crate of onions, and turned to the back door. "Well, you better not use words like irrational when you get there. You'll just make 'em think you're trying too hard." June didn't answer. She just looked back down at the page. What could she possibly bring to a room full of professors and textbook authors? She had never taken geometry formally. She'd never been graded past 8th grade. Her handwriting curved and bent like stalks in the wind. Her diagrams were drawn with a stick in mud before they ever reached paper. But deep down, June knew something no test had ever measured. She saw the world in patterns, not rules. That night, she flipped back to the earliest pages, the first time she ever tried to draw a circle. It wasn't really a circle, just a looping oval with arrows pointing at nothing. She had labeled it Endless Number. She was 10 years old. She turned the pages slowly. There were diagrams of spirals, triangles resting inside rectangles, sequences made of pebbles she arranged in rows, strange notes like, "I think 2 is the distance between belief and fact. Pi is a circle's heartbeat. You can't divide air, but it still fills the room evenly." It was odd. It was flawed. But it was hers. 2 days before departure, June walked to the bus station in town with her mother to pick up the travel voucher mailed by the conference committee. She wore her best flannel. It still had a tear near the elbow. In the waiting area, a small boy sat cross-legged with an iPad. When June passed by, he looked up at her boots, smeared with dust from walking, then whispered something to his dad. "Probably here to clean," the man muttered back, not quietly. June lowered her eyes and kept walking. Her mother noticed. "You sure you want to go where folks think like that?" June nodded. "Yeah," she whispered, "because maybe one of them doesn't." Back at home, June began to prepare. She didn't know how to make PowerPoints. She didn't have a laptop, but she had an old roll of butcher paper her mother used for wrapping produce. She cleared a space on the barn floor, rolled it out, and began drawing, kneeling, barefoot, her palms pressed against cool concrete as she outlined her ideas in charcoal. The spiral took up the center. Around it, she added annotations like, "The irrational number is not undefined. It's unfinishing." It's not about digits. It's about the shape of what never stops. She drew arrows, folded tabs, colored in ratios with leftover food dye. Mr. Dell stopped by again that evening. When he stepped into the barn, he stood in stunned silence. "You built a lecture on butcher paper." June looked up and smiled faintly. "Only thing big enough?" He walked closer and crouched beside the spiral. "This is beautiful," he murmured. "No one's gonna take it seriously," she said quietly. "I'm not even sure I do." But he looked at her, stern now. "June, you didn't invent a proof. You offered a language. One people can feel before they even calculate. That's more than serious. That's revolutionary." Later that night, Mr. Dell brought her a surprise. A portable foam board with wooden clips and a rolled-up canvas poster. He'd scanned her drawings and printed them professionally. June was stunned. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it won't smudge if someone sneezes in the front row." She giggled. She hadn't laughed like that in months. The night before departure, she repacked everything 6 times. Her mom made her peanut butter sandwiches and folded them into wax paper. "You're not going to eat anything from strangers, you hear?" June nodded. Her mom didn't cry when she hugged her at the bus stop. Didn't say, "I'm proud of you." Didn't say, "You can do this." But as the bus pulled away, June saw her mother raise one hand. Not waving, just holding it over her heart. It was enough. The ride to Denver took 8 hours and felt like 8 days. Out the window, the fields turned to towns, towns into concrete. Street signs grew larger. Gas stations turned into high-rises. Cell service came and went. June didn't sleep. She kept the notebook on her lap the entire ride, like a child would hold a toy or a shield. Her fingers traced the worn spine. She thought about the people she would meet, the ones with degrees, with words like tenure, with shoes that didn't squeak when you walked on tile. She wasn't one of them. But she wasn't trying to be. She just wanted to draw what she knew, even if they didn't believe her, especially then. The bus pulled into the station under a pale Denver morning. Skyscrapers stretched like glass needles into the cloud cover. There was wind, cold and smart and fast. June stepped down from the bus and adjusted her backpack. Her fingers trembled a little. A volunteer with a sign marked IFME stood nearby, scanning arrivals. "Miss Callahan?" June raised her hand. The woman smiled. "Welcome. We're glad you're here." And just like that, she wasn't in Kansas anymore. They brought her to a hotel that looked like it belonged in a movie. Polished tile, glass elevators, water fountains that made no sense. Her room had white sheets and a window that opened to the skyline. She laid her notebook on the desk and stared at it. It looked small now, like something that didn't belong in such a clean place. But she reminded herself, math didn't begin in marble halls. It began in sand, in stars, in wondering. She opened the notebook again. The spiral waited, just where she left it. She smiled. Then, slowly, deliberately, she added one more note at the bottom of the page. "This proof has no name, but neither did I, until I gave one to what I saw." The night before the presentation, June couldn't sleep. She tried. She turned off the lights, pulled the hotel comforter to her chin, and closed her eyes. But her brain spun like a pinwheel in the wind. Too many thoughts, too many rooms full of people who would never understand how far she'd come just to stand still. She sat up in bed and looked at her notebook again. The drawings were familiar, but her confidence in them wasn't. Each line that once felt like revelation now seemed too simple, too soft, too farm-grown. At home, the spiral had been enough. Here, it looked like something a child would doodle in the margins of a test she didn't understand. By 3 a.m., she was pacing the small room. She turned on the desk lamp and spread out her foam board. She stared at the spiral and the accompanying arrows. Her handwriting curved like vines. It wasn't just math. It was personal. Too personal. A gust of wind rattled the balcony door. Rain was tapping softly against the glass, like fingers knocking with increasing urgency. She stepped closer and opened the sliding door. The air smelled like electricity. And suddenly, she needed space. She carried the foam board and her sketch paper down the elevator, through the lobby, and out onto the small rooftop garden of the hotel. The security guard glanced up, but didn't stop her. It was drizzling. The kind of rain that made you feel awake, not soaked. There, under the amber glow of rooftop lights, June set the board on a concrete table and began redrawing her spiral. Not for the professors, not for the conference, but for herself. She needed to see it again, to be reminded. This was the shape that made her feel like numbers were alive, not just symbols. This was the shape that helped her believe math was not about status. It was about story. The wind picked up. She pushed the edges of the poster down with water bottles. Her hair stuck to her cheeks. Her fingers trembled with cold and doubt. But the spiral was forming again, wide, curved, steady. Until the rain changed, it came fast. A sudden wave of wind ripped one of the weights loose. The butcher paper flapped violently. Then, snap. A gust took the sheet straight off the table. June lunged, grabbed the edge, but it tore down the middle. The foam board clattered to the ground. Her charcoal sketches smeared across the wet pavement like bruises in ink. She dropped to her knees and tried to save it. Too late. The spiral, her spiral, bled across the concrete. For a moment, all she could do was stare at it. The only thing she had ever made that felt like it mattered was now soggy paper and ruined shapes. And still, the rain came. She gathered the torn pages and folded them into her jacket, unsure if she was shaking from the storm or from something deeper, like the feeling of being found out. You don't belong here, farm girl. Go home before you embarrass yourself. The voice wasn't real, but it sounded a lot like the people she hadn't met yet. And even louder, it sounded like the ones she'd known all her life. Back in her hotel room, June sat in the corner of the shower, fully clothed, the ruined sketches crumpled in her lap. She whispered, "I should have stayed in the fields." But after a long silence, another thought pushed through. What did the spiral mean to you before anyone else saw it? That question sat beside her like an old friend. She knew the answer. It was the one truth that hadn't washed away. When June was 9, her father died in a grain elevator accident. People said it was quick, instant, merciful. But June never asked for those details. What she remembered wasn't the sirens, or the silence. She remembered the week after, standing alone in the cornfield, staring at the stalks swaying in slow, perfect curves. That was the first time she ever tried to draw wind. It came out looking like a spiral that never ended, even when something else did. She'd forgotten that. Until now. Morning came like a curtain being ripped open, sharp, bright, and too fast. The conference center was already humming with activity when June walked in. Her eyes were red. Her drawings had been hastily recopied by hand on blank hotel stationery. Her foam board was damaged, warped slightly from the water. She looked like a mess, but she walked to the registration table anyway. The volunteer gave her a lanyard. Her name was misspelled. Jane Callahan. She didn't bother correcting it. What mattered was this: she still showed up. She found a quiet spot backstage. Other speakers were flipping through sleek slide decks, rehearsing intros, testing microphones. One man walked by, looked at her hand-drawn board, and chuckled. "Did you forget your laptop?" he said. She smiled, but said nothing. She was learning. Silence can speak too. Her session was called Alternative Frameworks for Abstract Thought. There were maybe 70 chairs in the room. Most were filled with professors, grad students, and bored observers flipping through printed schedules. The speaker before her, some PhD from Sweden, had just finished a flawless digital presentation on symbolic pattern emergence in multidimensional variable spaces. Polite applause. Then June was introduced. She stepped up slowly. Her foam board leaned against a metal easel. Her paper notes trembled in her hands. There was a long silence as she unfolded a diagram. The paper still smelled faintly of rain. She cleared her throat. "My name's June. I don't have a degree. I don't know most of the terms you use, but I do know something about shape." No one interrupted. She pointed at the spiral. "This is how I understand numbers that never end. This curve helps me feel the gap between fractions and the things that live between them." She spoke like she was explaining to a friend, not teaching, not proving, just sharing. "I didn't learn this in a classroom. I found it in a field, trying to figure out why the world never seemed to end the same way twice." A murmur passed through the audience. She went on. For 15 minutes, she explained how she used the spiral to visualize irrational numbers, not as unsolvable, but as shapes that continue beautifully and forever. She called it a geometry of wonder. At one point, she stopped and looked at the floor. "I know I'm not one of you, but I think maybe the way I see math might help someone who's always thought it wasn't for them." Then she stepped back from the board. That was it. No graphs, no algorithms, just shapes, truth, and the silence that follows honesty. No one clapped right away. And that was the miracle. Because silence meant they were thinking. Then, one pair of hands, then another, and then thunder. A standing ovation. Not because she was perfect, because she reminded them what math was supposed to feel like. Mysterious, alive, reachable. Later that night, back in her room, June opened her notebook again. The last few pages were blank. She smiled and whispered, "There's still more to draw." And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the girl with dirt under her fingernails. She felt like the girl who taught the world how to see. 3 days had passed since the conference, and June still hadn't told her mother what happened. Not because it hadn't been incredible, not because she was ashamed, but because there were no words yet. No words for the feeling of being pulled aside by 3 different professors who said they wanted copies of her spiral. No words for the woman from the Netherlands who knelt beside her after the talk and whispered, "I teach children with dyscalculia. Your drawing. It unlocked something." No words for the moment she stood in front of the hotel bathroom mirror afterward, looked into her own sunburned face and said, "You did it." It wasn't pride. It was recognition of herself, by herself, maybe for the first time. When she stepped off the bus back in Kansas, no one was waiting. No balloons, no banners, no parade, just her mother's pickup idling under the cracked awning of the bus stop, windshield wipers batting away early morning fog. June opened the passenger door and climbed in. Her mother looked her over like someone checking for bruises, then asked, without turning her head, "Well?" June just smiled. "I showed them." And that was all she said, and that was all her mother needed. Back at the farm, everything was the same. The tomatoes had ripened. The goats had knocked over the compost bin again. Her brothers were arguing about gas money, and the satellite TV still didn't get more than 5 channels. But June was not the same. She noticed things now. Not just the way the fields curved under the sun, but how even doubt had shape. Round at first, then jagged, then thin until it disappeared. She spent most of her free time in the barn, redrawing her spiral on canvas. This time bigger, cleaner, more layered. She didn't care if no one ever saw it again. She had proven something, if only to herself. Until the letter came. It was late afternoon when the mail truck clattered up the gravel drive. Her younger brother, Miles, brought it in with a yell. "June, something for you! Looks fancy!" She stepped out of the barn, wiping charcoal off her hands, still in her coveralls. Miles waved the envelope like a flag. It was cream-colored, heavy, and sealed with gold foil. Embossed in the top left corner were the words, "Colorado Institute for Mathematical Education Dean's Office, Boulder Campus." She turned it over, her fingers suddenly slick with sweat. Her mother stepped onto the porch, drying her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" she asked. June didn't answer. She opened the letter and read, "Dear Ms. Callahan, we had the honor of watching your recent presentation at IFME Denver. Your spiral-based conceptualization of irrational numbers represents not only a breakthrough in pedagogical clarity, but also a stunning example of intuitive mathematical intelligence. We would be honored to offer you a full academic scholarship to the Colorado Institute for Mathematical Education, including housing and mentorship under Dr. Henry Rusk. We believe your voice belongs in the future of mathematics. Should you choose to accept, we will assist with all required documentation and transitional needs. Sincerely, Dean Elizabeth Hartwell." June read the letter twice, then a third time, then looked up. Her mother hadn't moved. "You okay, honey?" she asked softly. June nodded, then shook her head, then said, "They want me to come learn, for free, with a mentor." Her mother blinked. "At college?" "Not just any college. A math institute. They saw me speak. They think I have something worth growing." For the first time, her mother sat down right there on the porch steps. Not because she didn't believe it, but because part of her always had. And that kind of truth hits harder than surprise. The next week passed like a dream June didn't want to wake from. Phone calls, forms, a video meeting with the dean who used the word brilliant 3 times and rare mind twice. She was assigned a mentor, Dr. Henry Rusk, a researcher who specialized in cognitive math visualization. He said he'd never seen anything like her work. Not in textbooks, not in peer-reviewed journals, not even from graduate students. "Irrational numbers have always been a wall," he said. "You turn them into a door." June didn't know what to say, so she just said, "I didn't mean to. I was just trying to see something that felt honest." He smiled. "That's exactly why it matters." The official acceptance packet arrived on a Friday. Inside was an ID card with her picture. She'd had to email one, and it turned out a photo in front of the goat shed was the only one she had. There was also a class schedule, a housing form, and a welcome letter with the sentence, "We look forward to what your mind will add to our community." It was the first time June had ever been referred to as a contributor. Not a helper, not a worker, not a visitor, but someone who could add. She stared at that sentence for nearly half an hour. Then she folded the paper, pressed it to her chest, and whispered, "Maybe I'm not just passing through this world after all." That night, she and her mother sat on the porch watching the sky split open with stars. The wind smelled like dried hay and coming change. Her mother spoke first. "You know, when you were little, I caught you trying to count the spaces between the fence posts." June laughed softly. "I remember. You said numbers felt lonely if they didn't have something to lean on." "They still do," June whispered. Her mother looked over at her. "Do you want to go?" June nodded slowly. "I do." "Even if it's far?" June smiled. "I think far is where the next answers are." As summer faded into fall, June packed a suitcase with more paper than clothes. Mr. Dell stopped by one last time to bring her a new notebook, leather-bound, gold-stitched. "I think you'll be needing this," he said. She opened to the first page, blank, waiting. Then she turned back to her old one, the black notebook that had started it all. The final page held only a short sentence, scrawled days before she ever left for Denver. "Maybe the point of math is not to solve things, but to hold what can't be solved, gently." She traced the words with one finger, then closed the notebook. For now. The first thing June noticed about the Colorado Institute for Mathematical Education wasn't the size. It was the silence. The kind that sat under polished ceilings and wrapped around chrome elevators. The kind that hummed through whiteboards before ideas were born and lingered in stairwells long after the conversations ended. And then there were the suits. Everywhere. Sharp collars, polished shoes, lanyards with acronyms she didn't recognize. No one wore denim, no one smelled like hay, and no one, absolutely no one, walked barefoot. June arrived with a single suitcase, a canvas portfolio, and her notebook tucked under her arm like armor. Her assigned dorm room had beige walls and a small desk beneath a sterile lamp. The sheets were stiff. The window didn't face anything green, and for the first time since the conference, June felt unrooted. The next morning, she dressed exactly as she had at home: boots, rolled sleeves, hair braided down her back. She hesitated before stepping into the main lecture building, her clothes, her silence, her story clashing against the current like a leaf in a steel river. Still, she walked in. Her first class was titled Advanced Conceptual Frameworks for Infinite Structures. The room held maybe 20 students, some barely older than her, others clearly graduate fellows. They sat in tiers, notebooks open, tablets glowing, posture perfect. When June entered, several heads turned, some just out of curiosity. Some lingered. One student whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "Is that the spiral girl?" Another smirked. "Guess they're letting rural internships in now." June sat at the back, quietly. No one sat beside her. The professor entered 10 minutes late. He was tall, with a salt and pepper beard, a black suit, and the kind of gait that said he'd published too much to care what you thought. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the room, then at the roster. "Callahan," he read aloud. June raised her hand. His eyes flicked toward her, then dropped. Then he began. For the next 50 minutes he spoke fast and flat, tossing out terms like asymptotic density and unprovable convergence assumptions as if they were common grocery items. He didn't write on the board. He didn't ask questions. He just lectured. Until the last 10 minutes. Then he stopped, turned, and said, "You've all seen irrational numbers as an annoyance. Today I want you to see them as structureless chaos, undefined, imprecise, stubbornly uncooperative, the true outsiders of arithmetic order." He paused, then looked at June. "Unless..." Perhaps Miss Callahan disagrees. The room went still. 20 pairs of eyes turned to her. June felt the warmth crawl up her neck. He wasn't curious. He was baiting her. She looked down, then looked back up, and said quietly, "I think irrational numbers aren't uncooperative. I think they're honest." A few students chuckled. The professor smiled, tight-lipped. "Honest?" June nodded. "They tell us there's more between things than we can count, that not everything has to fit. They don't lie to match a box we drew around them. They just stay true to their shape." The silence shifted, less amused, more attentive. The professor raised an eyebrow. "Would you care to illustrate?" June stood. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. She walked to the front of the room, picked up the chalk, and drew a square, a triangle, a diagonal, then the second, then the third, and with each one, the spiral grew. "Each step outward," she said, "is a new irrational born from a rational frame." She paused. "They're not chaos. They're rhythm." The professor stared at the board, then at her, then turned to the class and said, "Class dismissed." Just like that. No nod, no thanks, no comment. He walked out. The door clicked shut. No one moved. Until a student in the front row, long coat, thin glasses, slowly clapped twice, then stopped. But it was enough. June walked back to her seat, sat down, and quietly opened her notebook. That night, someone slipped a folded note under her dorm room door. It read, "I've studied irrational numbers for 3 years and never understood them until today. Thank you. E.M." She didn't know who E.M. was, but she smiled, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel out of place. The conference hall wasn't built for girls like her. It was marble-floored and chandelier-lit, with velvet curtains drawn back like theater wings, and rows of spotless white chairs aligned in military precision. Name cards shimmered under the soft gold lighting. Dr. Ivanovich, Professor Wen, Dr. Mallory Rusk. Names she'd only seen in the backs of math textbooks from the town library, when the pages weren't already torn out. June stood at the edge of the stage, holding a rolled canvas under one arm and a cheap foam board under the other. She wore her only clean button-up shirt, tucked into faded jeans, and boots she had tried to scrub free of dirt, though the soles still left faint tracks. A man with a microphone walked over. "Miss Callahan?" She nodded, suddenly aware of how dry her mouth was. "You'll be presenting after Professor Lang's session. We've allocated you 20 minutes. 20 minutes. To explain how she saw the unseeable, to defend a shape she found under a tractor's shadow, to speak their language with her voice. June swallowed. "I'll need 5 minutes to set up," she said quietly. The man raised an eyebrow, perhaps surprised she didn't stutter. "No problem," he said. "Good luck." She didn't need luck. She needed to remember why she came. Backstage, she sat on a folding chair, her hands clenched into fists. Professor Lang's voice echoed from the stage, smooth and practiced. And in evaluating the infinite sum, we reapproach the irrational constant from a place of symbolic weight, not numerical instability. His slideshow buzzed with animations. The room laughed politely at a few dry jokes. Even from behind the curtain, June could feel the walls vibrating with jargon and assurance. Her notebook rested on her lap. Her drawings were smudged at the corners from so many rewrites, but the spiral still held its shape, like it always had. She remembered what Mr. Dell told her in the barn. "You're not here to impress them. You're here to remind them what they forgot." A soft bell chimed. Professor Lang wrapped up with a crisp bow. polite applause, then silence, and then her name. She stepped onto the stage like someone walking into a church they weren't sure would welcome them. The lights were warm, the eyes warmer, staring, waiting, doubting. Her boots made a hollow sound on the polished wood. She walked to the easel and set up her foam board. It was plain, hand-lettered, curves drawn in charcoal, arrows painted with the tip of a spoon dipped in ink. Someone in the third row leaned to whisper something, and June saw a chuckle. But she didn't flinch. She breathed in. Once. Then she began. My name is June Callahan. I'm not a professor. I'm not even a high school graduate. I work on a farm in Kansas. A rustle went through the crowd. Someone crossed their arms. I was invited here to talk about irrational numbers, she continued, but I'm not going to show you a formula. A pause. I'm going to show you something I drew in the dirt. She reached behind her and pulled up the canvas roll. It was her spiral, the same one she first saw in her head at age 10, now redrawn, repainted, carefully annotated. She hung it next to the foam board, stepped aside, and pointed. This is how I understand numbers that never end. She explained slowly, her voice soft but steady. Each triangle in the spiral had 2 known legs. Each diagonal was the irrational number born between them. The spiral continued, past square roots of 2, 3, 5, onward into spaces without end, yet held in shape. I couldn't remember the right terms, she said, but I could feel where the shapes didn't fit. That's where irrational numbers live, not between lines, but between expectations. Someone at the back shifted in their seat. Another leaned forward. June took a breath. The hardest part was still ahead. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage. I'm not asking you to believe this is a proof. I'm asking you to remember what math felt like before you were told it had to be hard. Now the room was completely still. No coughing, no whispers, no fingers tapping on phones. Just silence. Then she told them about the cornfield, about the wind, about her father's accident, about the night she first tried to draw infinity with a stick. This spiral, she said quietly, wasn't about answers. It was about trying to hold something that didn't want to be held. It's messy, but it's true. And it belongs to more people than we've let believe it does. She looked out across the room. I didn't come here to be approved. I came here because someone has to say, math belongs to the ones who've been told they don't. And then she stepped back. No dramatic exit, no applause cue, just the sound of her boot brushing the floor as she returned to her spot. Silence again. Not the kind that follows failure. The kind that follows impact. Then, a single pair of hands, clapping, then another, and another, until the room was standing. Some clapped hesitantly, some clapped with force. A few had tears in their eyes, but no one laughed. And no one spoke, because June had already said what they didn't know they'd needed to hear. Backstage, someone stopped her. It was an older woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, wearing a name tag that read, Dr. Elise Garot, Paris Mathematics Institute. She didn't ask a question. She simply said, You have changed the way I think about teaching. June blinked, and for the first time all day her voice trembled when she said, Thank you. I just wanted to show the truth. Dr. Garot smiled. Truth doesn't always speak the language of prestige, but it always makes itself known. Then she walked away. That night, June stood outside the conference center, holding her board and canvas under her arm. The rain had come again, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She let it touch the edge of the spiral. It didn't smear. It shimmered. For the next 2 days, no one at the conference said much to June. No reporters with badges, no interview requests, no professors knocking on her door asking for copies of her spiral. It was as if the world had exhaled and then forgotten to breathe back in. June didn't mind. She walked the polished halls quietly, listening to conversations that drifted out of closed rooms. Actually referenced her diagram. Unbelievable. Felt more like a sermon than a lecture. But the children might understand it, that's the scary part. She took notes in the margins of her program, not about their words, but their silences. Because the air was charged, not with noise, with consideration. Like something had been shaken loose but hadn't settled yet. She spent her final afternoon wandering the exhibitor hall, not as a speaker now, but as a spectator. At booth number 14, a tech startup was showcasing an augmented reality theorem tool. One developer leaned over and whispered to another as June passed. "She's the girl from the spiral," he said. The other nodded. "I thought she'd be taller." June kept walking. At booth number 27, a graduate student from Columbia stood beside a monitor showing graphs that twisted like ribbon candy. She spotted June and froze, eyes wide. I saw your talk," she said. "I tried explaining square roots to my niece using your spiral. She actually got it. And she's 7. June blinked. That was the first time anyone at the conference had told her she mattered. She smiled gently. "Thank you. That means more than you think." Later that evening, she returned to her room and found a white envelope slipped under the door. No name, no stamp, just 2 words typed neatly on the front. For June. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a folded sheet of fine linen paper, embossed with a seal she didn't recognize. "Miss Callahan, your presentation stirred more than conversation. It stirred pedagogy itself. I believe the future of mathematical education must include voices like yours. Would you consider visiting Princeton next spring as a guest contributor to our Alternative Reasoning in Mathematics series? Expenses covered, of course. We'd be honored to hear you speak again. Warmly, Dr. Samuel Adler Chair, Department of Pure Mathematics, Princeton University." June read the letter twice, then a third time, just to feel the words again. Princeton. A girl with dirt-stained notebooks and spiral logic was being invited to Princeton. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both, quietly, by the window, as the city lights below flickered like candles. She called her mother that night. "Did you win something?" her mom asked. June shook her head even though no one could see. "No, but they're listening." "Listening to what?" "To the shape I saw." A pause on the line. "Well," her mom finally said, "I hope they clean their ears out real good then." June laughed. "They're not bad people, Mom. Just used to only looking one way. Maybe you gave them a second direction." "Maybe." Another pause. "Do you want to go?" "To that, what was it?" "Princeton." "That a town or a school?" "It's both." "Well, you better bring clean socks." The next morning, as she packed her spiral board and notebook, she felt a new kind of stillness. Not fear. Readiness. She hadn't come here for fame or followers. She came because something inside her refused to stay small, and now that something was being asked to grow. At the farewell brunch, she sat alone near the back. sipping weak orange juice and picking at a dry croissant. Across the ballroom, a group of panelists was discussing curriculum reform. Someone was talking into a microphone. Then her name came up. Not loudly, not ceremoniously, just dropped in, mid-sentence. Like Miss Callahan's visualization, which offers a compelling argument for rethinking how we teach number theory at the primary level. June froze. No one noticed, but to her, it sounded like thunder. Not the violent kind, the distant, rolling kind. The kind that meant a storm had already come, and something green was going to grow because of it. Back on the train ride home, June watched the horizon blur with fields and clouds. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notebook. The old one. The cover was cracked now, its corners curled like dried leaves. She flipped to the back. There were only a few blank pages left. She picked up her pen. Wrote, "I thought the spiral ended where it turned too tight to follow, but now I see. That's where it begins again." The train rolled past a stretch of land dotted with silos and wheat. She closed her eyes and saw it again, the shape that had carried her from the dirt to the stage, from Kansas to curiosity, from silence to thunder. A shape she didn't invent, but did discover. A shape that didn't need her name to be remembered. But now, it had one. The article came out 3 days after she returned home. June didn't know it existed until Mr. Dell drove up the long gravel path holding a folded newspaper in one hand and a look on his face that said, "Read this carefully." The headline was bold, centered on page 2 of the National Educator Weekly. "Can Dirt Teach Math? A Farm Girl's Spiral Sparks Debate." Her name wasn't in the title, but her face was, grainy, low-res, and clearly taken from a conference video still. She was mid-sentence, one hand pointing to her hand-drawn spiral, eyes wide and earnest. June read the article at the kitchen table while her mother stirred stew nearby. The radio played low, but neither of them heard it. She wore boots. She carried paper instead of PowerPoint. And she drew her proof on a board more suitable for crop prices than calculus. Yet Miss June Callahan, a 16-year-old with no formal secondary education, has captured the attention of Ivy League professors with her so-called spiral of the irrationals. Some call it refreshing. Others call it reckless. We should be careful about elevating anecdotes over evidence, warns Dr. Hal Green, a senior curriculum advisor. Still, for better or worse, the spiral is now being shared in classrooms worldwide, and math, it seems, is no longer just for the credentialed. By the time she finished reading, June's hands had curled the paper into a trembling tube. Her mother walked over and gently took it from her. "Well," she said, folding the article flat again, "they spelled your name right, at least." June didn't answer. It wasn't just the skepticism, it was the tone. As if her presence at the table had been an accident, a glitch, a curiosity better kept in a museum than a classroom. And yet, she couldn't say they were entirely wrong. She wasn't qualified. She wasn't trained. She wasn't polished. She was a girl with a spiral and a pencil, and somehow that was threatening enough to get printed in national news. More articles followed, some glowing. She brought wonder back to numbers. Some scathing, a charming story. But let's not confuse sentiment with scholarship. Even social media took sides. One tweet read, "She's what happens when you let emotions enter equations." Another, "My 8th graders finally understood square roots thanks to June Callahan. That's all the proof I need." June stopped reading after a while. Not because she didn't care, because she cared too much. Dr. Rusk from the Colorado Institute called to check on her. "I'm sorry about the press," he said gently. "We should have protected you better." "I'm not angry," June said. "Then what are you?" She thought a moment. "Tired." He hesitated. "You don't have to carry this alone. You can still come here, June. The offer stands, the lab, the lectures, the fellowship. You earned all of it." She looked out the window. The fields had started turning gold again. Late summer had softened the harsh lines of spring. Everything was slowing down. "I know," she whispered, "but I think I want to try something else first." 2 weeks later, flyers began appearing on telephone poles in Perry County. Free math mornings with June Callahan. Under the willow tree, Saturdays 9 a.m. No grades, no tests, just questions, and shapes, and stories. For anyone who's ever felt math wasn't theirs. She made the posters by hand with charcoal sketches of her spiral in the corner. By the third Saturday, 17 kids showed up. Some barefoot, some shy. One with an old TI-83 calculator he didn't know how to turn on. June knelt in the grass, rolled out a canvas, and started drawing in the dirt with a stick. "This is a triangle," she said. "But not just any triangle. It's the beginning of a number we can't write down completely. A number that keeps going." The kids leaned in. No one laughed. No one raised their hand to ask if she had a degree. They just watched, and listened, and wondered. By the end of September, she had over 50 students. Local teachers began to visit, sitting cross-legged among the children, taking notes. One brought a camcorder. Another brought donuts. June didn't charge a dime. People offered. She declined. "This isn't for money," she said. "It's for the version of me that never saw herself in a math book." That fall, an envelope arrived from Princeton. Inside was a single handwritten card. "Your silence is louder than our applause. We still hope you'll come when you're ready. Dr. Samuel Adler." She smiled, folded the card, and tucked it into the back of her old notebook. One day in early October, as she was packing up her spiral board after a lesson, a young boy named Micah tugged on her sleeve. "Miss June," he said, "are you famous?" She paused, then knelt beside him. "I don't think so," she said, "but you're in a magazine." "I know." He looked at her seriously. "Then why are you here? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, somewhere important?" June thought about that, then took his hand and pointed at the canvas. "Do you see this shape?" He nodded. "It showed up in my head when I was standing in the dirt. Not in a big city, not in a lab. Here, on ground like this, with wind and weeds and no one watching." She looked at him. "So I figured maybe the best place to share it again is where it first found me." Micah nodded solemnly. "I think it likes it here." That night, June walked out to the edge of the field with her notebook and sat under the willow tree. She opened to the last page, and for the first time in weeks, picked up a pen. She wrote, "Let them call me a farmhand. They don't know the land can teach too." Then she looked up at the stars. No cameras, no crowds, no applause. Just the sound of wind folding gently through dry grass. Like a whisper, like a promise. The boy never said a word. He started coming to June's Saturday lessons sometime in late October. Small, pale, always wearing the same navy hoodie with the sleeves pulled over his hands. His name was Isaiah, though it took June 2 weeks to learn that. Not from him, but from a neighbor who dropped off pumpkins and whispered, "His mama says he hasn't spoken in years. Not since his dad left." He never made a sound, never answered questions, never raised his hand. But he came, every single week, and he drew, always drawing. Isaiah would sit at the edge of the circle under the willow tree, a few feet back from the rest of the kids, and pull out a stubby pencil and a thick stack of folded papers. While June spoke about irrational numbers or drew arcs in the soil, he would sketch, fast, fierce, focused. Sometimes she'd glance over and catch a glimpse. Fractals, spirals, circles inside circles. He didn't copy her. He extended her. His curves were longer, deeper. His notations weren't words, but clusters of arrows and patterns, like music with no notes. And though he never looked her in the eyes, she felt seen, completely. One day, the weather turned early. It was the first frost of the season, and the field was too cold to teach in. June moved the lesson to the barn. The old Callahan barn had once held hay, and then goats, and then rusting tools. But now it held something else. Long planks of wood, crates of chalk, canvas, and a small heater she had salvaged from a church rummage sale. She hung string lights along the rafters. When the kids arrived, the space felt almost magical. Isaiah came too, silent, hoodie zipped, sketchbook under his arm. June smiled at him when he entered. He didn't smile back. But he didn't walk away. That, for her, was enough. That morning, she taught a lesson on the square root of 5. Using chalk and her spiral, she showed how each diagonal in the construction held something beyond counting, beyond closure. Then she asked the class, "What do you think comes next?" Micah raised his hand. "The square root of 6? She nodded. "Yes, but what does it feel like?" The room was quiet. Then Isaiah stood up. Without a word, he walked to the side of the barn where a massive piece of plywood leaned against a post. He flipped open his sketchpad, studied it briefly, and picked up a piece of white chalk. The room held its breath. He didn't speak. He just drew. First, a spiral, similar to June's, but not quite. His arcs were smoother, and they didn't just turn outward. They curled back in places, like the tide pulling away from itself. Then he added notches, not between the spirals, but within the lines themselves. Tiny breaks, repeats, almost like beats in a song. And finally, he drew a curve that crossed through all the irrational diagonals, not as a limit, but as a bridge. It wasn't a continuation. It was a return. When he stepped back, the room was silent. June walked forward slowly, heart pounding, and stared at what he had made. I never thought to connect them," she whispered. Isaiah didn't respond, but his eyes looked directly into hers, and that said enough. After the children left, June stayed in the barn long after dark. She redrew Isaiah's spiral on canvas, trying to understand it. The notches, the return, the rhythm inside the irrational. It was more than a number. It was something living. She realized something that startled her. All this time, she had taught the spiral as a way to escape measurement. But Isaiah had shown her that even in the endless, something might want to come home. The next morning, she called Dr. Rusk. He answered on the second ring. "June?" he said, surprised. "You okay?" "I think I've been teaching it wrong," she said. There was a pause. "Explain." She told him about Isaiah, about the curve, about the return. When she finished, Rusk was quiet. Then he said, "You're not wrong. You're growing. That's different." She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Dr. Rusk," she asked, Can something be irrational and still belong? He smiled on the other end of the line. That's not a math question, June. That's a human one. That weekend, June added a new lesson to her board. She didn't call it the spiral anymore. She called it the fold, because it didn't just stretch outward into the unknown. It curved gently back, like arms wrapping around a question too big to solve. And at the bottom of the board, she wrote in big charcoal letters, "Even the endless deserves to be held." Isaiah still never spoke. But every Saturday he arrived early and stayed late. Sometimes they drew together in silence. One spiral, two pencils, a barn full of dust and light and a kind of peace neither of them had known in a classroom. One day in November, a woman arrived at the barn in a gray coat, carrying a briefcase. She introduced herself as Mara Singer, a representative from the Department of Education. "I'm here because of this," she said, holding up a printed photo of Isaiah's spiral. "How did you—" "It's been circulating," she said. "No one knows who drew it, but it's brilliant. It completes something we didn't know was unfinished." June didn't respond. "I'd like to speak with the child who made it," the woman continued. June shook her head. "No," she said simply. Mara frowned. "Why not?" June looked past her, toward the barn wall where the spiral still glowed faintly in chalk. "Because this isn't about showcasing him. It's about protecting him." "Protecting him from what?" June met her eyes. "From the noise." That night, June stood under the willow tree and opened her second notebook. It was almost full now. On the last page, she wrote, "Some spirals stretch until they vanish. Others fold until they're understood." Then she drew one final arc. It curved in, and in, and in, but never closed. A perfect place to end. Or maybe to begin again. The textbook was published 3 years later. Its cover showed no spiral, no barn, no dusty boots or willow trees, just a sleek, minimal design with the words, "Foundations of Mathematical Intuition, a Visual Approach to the Irrationals," with contributions from Callahan, Rusk, Adler, and Singer. It was used in over 400 districts by the end of the first year. In Chapter 4, between pages on irrational constants and traditional proofs of 2, there was a sidebar with a grayscale illustration, hand-drawn, unpolished, unmistakable. A spiral. Below it, Callahan's folded spiral, a heuristic tool for teaching irrational magnitude as emotional distance and spatial return. There was no photo, no bio, just a caption that read, "Source, J. Callahan, Perry County, KS." For most students, it was just another diagram. For the few who looked deeper, it felt like something else, like an open door. By then, June was no longer teaching under the willow tree. The branches had begun to wither. A summer storm had split the trunk clean down the center, and the field became too muddy for children to sit in. So she moved the lessons indoors, into the same barn where Isaiah had once drawn a return into the spiral. She fixed up the roof, swept out the dust, hung long sheets of canvas across the rafters, and lined the walls with crates of chalk and notebooks and second-hand erasers. They called it the fold. She didn't call it anything. To her, it was still just the place where questions went to breathe. Students came from all over now. Not just Perry County, not just Kansas. A mother from Nebraska drove 6 hours with her dyslexic daughter after seeing one of June's lesson clips go viral on an education blog. A retired physicist from Chicago sat in the back row every Thursday and never asked a question. He just listened. Kids who failed algebra twice now ran their fingers through chalk spirals and whispered, "Oh, I get it." And every week, June stood barefoot on the wooden platform, chalk in hand, eyes quiet but steady. She still wore the same kind of clothes, rolled-up sleeves, old boots, ponytail tucked through a worn baseball cap. No one cared what she looked like anymore. They only cared how she made math feel. Reporters called, publishers called, universities sent letters, one after another. "We'd like to record your methods. Would you consider a TED Talk? We'd like to nominate you for..." June read every one, then placed them in a shoebox marked later. She never said no, but she never said yes. She had already stood on a stage once. She didn't need to again. One winter morning, a camera crew from a European documentary team arrived without warning. They had tracked her down through a university database. They brought lights, microphones, and a young woman with a clipboard who asked, "Can we get a clean shot of you drawing the spiral?" June blinked. "Why?" "For the story," the woman said. "We're calling it The Girl Who Made Math Gentle." June shook her head. "It's not my story," she said softly. "It belongs to whoever sees the shape and feels less afraid." The crew left without filming. Not angrily, just quietly, as if they understood something they hadn't expected to. She rarely spoke of Princeton anymore. Dr. Adler had remained in touch, always respectful, always hopeful she'd one day return as a guest. She didn't. He sent her a single email the week the textbook went to print. "You rewrote the way we think about proof, without trying to, and that's why it will last longer than any of ours." She never replied. She didn't need to. Isaiah still came every week. He was 12 now, taller. His hood came off more often. His hands no longer trembled when he drew, and though he still didn't speak, his presence had become a language all its own. He once handed June a piece of paper with just one line. "I don't talk, but you do, and you said enough for me to draw forever." June kept it pinned to the wall beside her board. More valuable than any diploma. One spring afternoon, after the lesson ended and the barn had emptied out, a young man lingered at the doorway. He looked about 19, thin, nervous, clutching a leather-bound journal. "Are you Miss Callahan?" he asked. "I am," she said gently. He stepped forward. "My grandfather told me about you. He said he saw you speak once. He called you the girl who made numbers into stories." June smiled. "That was a long time ago." The young man hesitated, then opened his journal. Inside, spirals, but not hers. His own versions. One was a triangle folded into a circle. Another was a loop that looked like a question mark melting into a wave. "I don't know if they make sense," he said. She leaned in. "They don't have to yet," she said. "They just have to speak." He looked at her. "Do yours still speak?" June looked down at her own notebook, the third one now. Only 3 pages left. She nodded. Quietly. Then she handed him a piece of chalk. "Want to draw on the barn wall?" His eyes lit up. And he did. That evening, as the sun slid behind the fields, June sat alone on the steps of the barn, knees tucked up, arms wrapped around herself. The sky looked like a chalkboard just after erasing, soft gray, still smudged with streaks of light. She opened her notebook to the last page, wrote, her name was June. She grew up in dirt. She drew what she couldn't explain, and somehow the world listened. Then she closed it. Not because the story was done, but because the next spiral didn't need her to start it. It just needed someone, anyone, willing to draw the first curve.